Yes, we are.
Okay, so now we have to walk me through this business of sharing the screen. So I will do that. Okay, does that work for you guys?
Looks perfect.
It's
Great.
great.
Excellent. Well, just first of all, just thank you all so much. I'm I'm honored. So here's I just opening with this picture from where I work in Labrador, near a lake in the middle of the province, comes us in, and it's probably it's one of the places that was where the last of the Wisconsin glacial ice lingered. So there was the last of the Laurentide ice sheet was sort of dwindled down, to vicinity of the George River around 7,000 years ago, and with it, long it was still there when the first ancestors of the Innu of today, the Indian people of today, arrived in the area. And when you walk around the landscape there, there's kind of a haunted sense of everybody of everything watching you. These boulders sort of left behind by the glacial ice. Have a kind of an animacy about them. You sort of always looking over your shoulder, and they speak to me about ancestors on the land, places that resonate with people that have been there before. And so I would just like to just say hello or just acknowledge the presence of Gene Winters, the society is named after. And I first went to the Peabody Museum, uh, I don't know, as an undergraduate, in the late 60s, early 70s. And I met Gene then. And over the succeeding almost 50 years, I must say I ran into him on several occasions visiting the museum. And um, I was touched then, and I remain indebted now to his graciousness and the graciousness of many of the museum people and the amateur archaeologists, the antiquarians, the people that shaped my early career in archaeology, and just an abiding sense of kindness that resided in those people. And so I'm honored and appreciative of that. And I just would like to mention Gene and thinking about him and how much he figured in my early way of what it was to be a good archaeologist, which was to be kind, to be kind to and always opening doors to people. So that's what Gene. And I also just want to make a very quick announcement. I have a couple of photographs, slides of mortuary features, that figure in my story. There are no human remains displayed. Um, and I think the discipline is in a discussion just now about the proper showing or use of mortuary objects. And so I just want to I acknowledge that I have a few, and I just sort of throw that out and just to be aware of that, and could talk more about that later if people had questions about it. Um, my talk today, it's kind of convoluted, but it it flows, I hope. Um, and and I'm as much a storyteller as I am an archaeologist. You won't see a single graph. I don't think there's no pie charts or statistical analyses here. It's more of a series of stories that I've strung together, and I hope in a logical fashion. And they center about my research interests in Labrador, my archaeological work there, but also a lot about the landscape, about the place that Labrador is. And you don't spend much time in Northern Labrador without hearing the stories about the Caribou House. Both the Inuit, the Eskimo people, and the Innu, the Indian people that live in Labrador, have stories about a mythical place in the heart of the Torngat Mountains, which has deep spiritual uh, 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 values. It's the home of It's the home of the animal masters. It's the home of the guardian spirits. Weather comes from that place. And among the Innu, there was this abiding belief in this hollow mountain where the king of the caribou, and you can see him here, would guard the caribou, the presence of the caribou when they weren't in the company of human beings. And the caribou would pass under the king of the caribou's belly into this hollow mountain, and that's where they would reside. And this was an explanation that they had for the seasonal appearance and disappearance of the caribou. So just to put us on the map, archaeologists have to have a map. Um, uh, Much of my story today centers around this stone, this very interesting lithic raw material called Ramah chert, which is found in a very distinct locus in northern Labrador, outcrops for a dozen miles, 20, 30 miles along the northern coast of Labrador. And it's adjacent to this area that has traditionally been talked about as being the abode of the animal masters, the king of the Caribou House. And so that is just to get us situated. And why I thought this talk might be of interest to people in Massachusetts is because Ramah chert, this stone, figures so significantly in the history of New England archaeology and Northeast archaeology. And the mystery about this raw material starts with the antiquarian exploits of Warren King Moore, Warren King Moorhead and Charles Willoughby digging the red paint Indian cemeteries in Maine, which is such a mysterious phenomenon that didn't quite fit into people's understanding of what the past might have looked like in New England, and there was a great mystery about these exotic bifaces, and you see some of them here in the lower left. And Ramah chert is it's an extraordinary stone. It can trend from being translucent, almost glass-like, to an opaque grayish black material, but often it's banded, and it has spectacular flint knapping qualities that make it an exceptional tool. So where did this and the mystery behind where this material came from figures significantly in some of the early speculations about New England and Northeast prehistory. And but like I said, I'm not going to show you any charts, but I'm going to try to tell you some stories. And I just want to acknowledge that, as an archaeologist, I've been trained to think certain ways. We make interpretations based on our knowledge and on our training, and the association of things that we see. And archaeologists use different tools. Indigenous storytellers have other ways of observation and knowledge. But I just want to let you know from the onset, I like to say, and I always do when I'm talking with Native communities, look, I'm making it all up. I've been trained to think this way, but I stand to be corrected. And so I'll give you that same that same advice. But part of the blessing of being an archaeologist working in the North, being able to work with Indigenous communities, is an opportunity to meet and travel and learn from older people that grew up in the country and grew up with an intimacy about land and animals and the way the world works that blew my mind when I was just a young undergraduate, that people had this kind of intimacy with place and with skills that I had imagined were long lost, the skills to travel, the skills to find food, the skills to survive. And through those opportunities of traveling and living with people, the evening spent around the campfire, in a tent, in a cabin, on the land, stories always go back to animals and this relationship, this very special relationship that human beings had maybe, maybe it's past tense, had with animals. That is like, it's just such a profoundly different way of thinking about the world and our place in the world. And it was something that I found to be fiercely desirable, and something I gravitated towards. Now, I know we're supposed to be talking about Labrador, but I'm going to make a quick segue over to Alaska, because I want to make a point that I'm going to develop as I go through this talk, which is that objects speak to us, that objects can tell us stories. And, archaeologists have their ways of interpreting things. Native people have their ways of interpreting things. And it coalesces around things, around objects, and the power that objects have to speak to us. And so there are no more eloquent objects. And now I'm putting on my museum curator's hat. One, I'm an extraordinarily lucky person in that I get to hang out in the attic of the museum, where these treasures from all over the world have been collected and preserved, and available for study and for reflection. And no more remarkable are the objects from the Yukon-Kuskokwim region of Alaska, where the Yupik people had developed an elaborate lifestyle predicated on, again, on their relationship to animals. And the thing about animals, I like to say that you're not a good hunter, you're not a clever hunter, you don't have better abilities to sneak up on animals. You're a devout hunter. That animals and humans have worked out a relationship, and that the animals and the animal masters that control the animals, that come in and go into the animals, will give the animals to the hunters that show respect. So respect and reciprocity are fundamental tenets in this relationship between what it is to be a good human being and the world that you live in. And it's very evident, this embedded spiritual nature of artifacts is incredibly prevalent, I think, in the Yupik tools. So here there's this whole class of masks, these ceremonial masks, that symbolize well, they show the animals, in this case, a guillemot, a pitsulak, a seabird, but in the back of it, emerging from it, is its inua, is its spirit, the spirit part of the animal. And you see it again in the seal mask, where the inua, the spirit of that animal, is a recognizable aspect of the relationship that you have with these creatures. And animals appreciate being hunted and killed, and butchered and used by hunters that are respectful and devout. And one way that hunters have to do that is by making beautiful things. And you see this in the Yupik assemblages, where again and again you get these symbols. So you have the caribou on the right, connected by this invisible line to its spirit self, its inua, and and you see it in the tools it make. So that the harpoon heads, in the upper left, is a predatory, carnivorous, hungry animal. That when you throw your harpoon, it's the hungry animal that's carrying it to its prey. And below it, you see a ivory wrench, carved in the shape of a caribou with a hole in the middle. And that hole was used as hunters would be making their arrow shafts, and they would steam the bent wood to bend it, and they'd run it back and forth through the belly of the caribou, bending it to make it straight, so that when you fired the arrow, it would go home. It was loaded with this kind of symbolic magic, and it would carry it home. Another object that speaks to that story is this little beautifully carved wooden box of a seal, that when you turn it over, reveals that it's a container for the delicate arrow points, that made out of slate that were too delicate to be, carried loosely around and had to be protected in a box until they were ready for use. And so when you took it out of its box, you took the arrow out of its box and mounted it on an arrow and you shot it, it went home, it would go home, it would go back to where it came from. And so these are the kinds of stories that I feel are evoked by these objects that speak directly to that relationship. And also to clothing that uh, animals from a distance, would see the hunters approach. And if they were well dressed, if they could be, if it was seen that the hunter and the families had used the gifts of the animals um, to make beautiful things, would be recognized by the animals and the animal spirits. And I love this quote attributed to a Nupiat hunter, a whaler, from Barrow, Alaska, that speaks to that, that he wasn't a good hunter. It was the fact that his wife dressed him in such beautiful clothes that the animals saw that and saw that they respected the animals. So this is this tenet, this fundamental aspect of the relationship of hunters and that I'm trying to get at that to tell the next part of my story. Um, if we come back across the North American Arctic back to Labrador, and the immediate ancestors, the grandfathers of the Innu families that I know and travel with, uh, they lived in the interior prior to village life, and the men there also were dressed in beautiful caribou skin clothing that had depicted on the clothing the interpretation of their dreams about where game could be found and animals could be honored. And the hunters, in talking about the dreams to their wives, the women would then translate those dreams into these symbols that would be painted on the hunting coats that would serve as a kind of a spiritual map, as it were, to guide the hunter to prey to the caribou that he was hunting. And in similar vein, robes like this were used by shamans using the same language, the same symbolic language of symbols that that speak to landscape topography, and a spiritual landscape as well as a real landscape, and that they would wave these robes at times of stress in order to attract the attention of the animal master, the king of the caribou, to come on, let's get on with it. Let your caribou go. We need to see the caribou. And you see that in the way that animal remains are treated as well. So that Innu camps traditionally, when the grandfather was killed, the skull would be placed on a pole, plug of tobacco would be put in its mouth, and it would be suspended, in a place that would allow the spirits to converse with the remains. And even today in Innu camps at the edge, people are living in town, they don't wear the painted caribou skin clothing anymore, but you go to the edge of the camp and you'll still find these trees, these kind of altars, as it were, where bear remains, caribou antlers would be placed, again, so so that the spirits could commune, and that you would recognize that obligation that you had as a hunter to meet the spiritual um, consequences of that thing that you do, that most dangerous thing that you do, which is killing and butchering animals and dealing with the souls of those animals. That's what I call my preface. That's sort of establishing the point I'm hoping to elaborate on when we switch from these beautiful objects to the more mundane stone tools, and I'm hoping to be able to carry some of those connections forth. So let's go back to Labrador. As I've mentioned, I've been been up and down Labrador now for over, well, almost 40 years now, I guess. Um, and as an anthropologist, as a student, as just, and it, just someone that wanted to get out into the country and travel with Native peoples, I've just been extremely fortunate. And so there's three ways of learning, and the very best way of learning, there's no doubt about it, is coming in from a cold day of looking for something to eat, finding the wood stove going in the tent, everybody gathered, everybody ready to tell stories about what they saw, and then what that joggled in their memory about other things and where they might go tomorrow, and that whole kind of relationship. And that's a very profound way of learning about place. Um, as an ethnohistorian, we add on another way of learning about people and place, because we have records, we have photographs, we can see that people are still living in the same place, but, seal skins and caribou skins have replaced canvas. But the stone ring is still, the tent is still being held by the stone, the ring of rocks, but and these records are eloquent. Hudson's Bay Company records, Moravian mission records, but they're extremely biased, right? They're from the perspective of traders or missionaries, but still they give us some insight into life. But then along comes the poor archaeologists, the people are gone, the tent's gone, the stories are gone. And what we're left is with this kind of bare bone set of data that we can examine and collect and try to tickle into giving us insights about past ways of life, that we are interested in revealing. Now, I have since the early 70s been going up to Labrador, initially as a crew member on William Fitzhugh from the Smithsonian's exploratory expeditions. We had a funky little boat that was our pride and joy, and which we used to explore all along the Labrador coast. And at the time, we had been preceded by, just one or two archaeologists in the 20s and the 30s, that found a site here, a site there. But we felt we were extraordinary adventurers, bravely going where no one had been before, and, pushing our way past ice into the unknown recesses of the past. Oh, you know, put a little, well, in contrast, like we may have been thinking we were great explorers, and yet everywhere we anchored for the night, there were native Inuit and Innu families camped, pursuing subsistence lifestyles that had gone back for centuries. And indeed, when and indeed, everywhere we went, we also found archaeological sites. So in fact, people had been there for thousands of years. And in the course of the 70s and the 80s, it was a really exciting time to be an archaeologist in Labrador as we began to unravel the culture history of Labrador and this interconnected, interlocking exchange of Indian and Inuit peoples for almost 8,000 years. And I'm going to spare you most of that today. It's a fascinating story, but we're talking about Ramah chert. So to get back to that story, the earliest evidence we have of people entering Labrador soon after the glacial ice disappeared. So remember that in the interior, the glacial ice lingered till after 7,000 years ago. And by that time, Amerindian, American Indian people were coming up, were exploring the coastal, uh, um, we're exploring the coast of the Maritimes, and following the rich marine resources up along the southern coast of Labrador to Labrador. And among the earliest evidence we have is of the Lansamore burial mound. It's over 7,000 years old, where a young man was found buried face down, covered in red ochre and placed with tools, to help him in the afterlife. But it was a real eye opener for the archaeologists at the time. It's just that the sophistication and the elaborate ceremonialism was just not something that had been suspected. Um, and as we found other sites from this time period, we recognized that many of the hunting tools were made out of this amazing stone that we knew of as Ramah chert. And you see two of these early spearheads on the right. Interestingly, whereas the hunting tools, the cutting and butchering tools are made of Ramah chert, um, other tools like scraping and hide preparing tools were made out of other kinds of cherts. But for hunting, it's almost always, with some exceptions, Ramah chert. And here you can see an example of these early stem projectile points. Now, we found numerous campsites, but we've also found a number of sites that begin to provide us some thought, some material on which to speculate about the spiritual significance, the supernatural significance of the stone that people were using, of the Ramah chert. And Chris Wolf excavated a pair of stone-lined pit houses just south of Saglac, about 40 miles south of the Ramah chert quarries. And when he cleaned out these houses, um, we got down to the habitation floor. There was very little material. There were a few flakes, there were some specks of charcoal, but in the middle of one house, there was the remains of a fire that had been mounded over with a small mound, a deposit of red ochre, into which two large Ramah chert byfaces had been stuck down into it as if they were on a spear, and then snapped, broken in half, and both pieces lay there. And then the house was abandoned. There was nothing else to be found in the house. So it's not typical, day-to-day occupation debris or habitation kind of activities, subsistence settlement activities we're seeing here. I think we're seeing some indication of some form of elaborate ritual. It's just speculative about what form that's taking, killing a house, honoring a recent deceased elder, or what, we don't know. But what we can, I think, safely assume is that this association of Ramah chert tools and red ochre has some spiritual significance. We carry that further if we go a little south of Saglac and White Point, where Chris Wolf's finds were, to Nuliak, which is the largest maritime archaic site on the Labrador coast and dates to about 4239 100 years ago. And at this site were numerous, 10, a dozen or so, multi-family longhouse structures. Again, not the kind of small, wigwams, little habitation structures that we might assume characterized early peoples in this kind of rugged near Arctic environment. But no, large communal longhouses, multiple families, probably boat crews, that probably had elaborate, we likened it to Northwest Coast analogy, it's just sort of elaborate ceremonialism and contacts, centered. We think Nuliak must be centered because it's the northernmost big occupation near the Ramah chert quarries. So probably a major activity that went on here was acquiring the Ramah chert, which was then traded or carried down to other maritime archaic groups all along the coast of Labrador down to the Strait of Belle Isle. And here you see some of the typical hunting tools. At Nuliak, there was two stone mounds that were partially excavated, and one produced this remarkable mortuary feature, where you can see at the bottom of the deposit, the pit was stained with copious amounts of red ochre. There were large uh, sheets of mica, seen here in the lower right corner, cut in a big oval shape, mirror-like substance, but then a plethora of Ramah chert tools, knives, and bifaces, um, many of them ritually broken, but all of them pristine, just in really, compared to that earlier slide where, you resharpen them and they get smaller over time. This was an extraordinary demonstration of value being placed in the graves. Also, these large uh, Ramachert bipointed bifaces that, again, these are all glued together, but they'd been ritually snapped in half. They'd been killed before being placed in the grave. And not at Nuliak, but at another site further south, where other red paint Indian, Moorhead Cemetery, Maritime Archaic Indian cemeteries been excavated. This practice of ritually killing or ritually destroying objects placed in the graves is evident here with beautiful celts and gouges that have been systematically smashed, destroyed, broken before being placed in the deposit. Back at Nuliak, also accompanying the mortuary deposits were Ramachert blanks. These are large bifaces that had been fleshed out at the quarry to make sure there were no flaws or imperfections in the stone, and then carried. And this is probably how a lot of Ramachert went south. But also in the case at this Nuliak site, they have also been ritually destroyed, crashed, and placed in the burial. So they haven't lost the value. Far from it. Their value is evident in their inclusion in this kind of mortuary ceremonialism. And then this brings us finally to New England, where the same kind of artifacts, these stem points and these large bifaces that appear at the mortuary sites in New England, in Labrador, the maritime archaic sites in Labrador, have been recovered from throughout New England. Most significantly, as the photograph on the left shows, in the Moorhead Cemetery red paint Indian graves in Maine, where stem points and bifaces have been found. But also, I've been able to ferret out in antiquarian collections throughout New England, in museums and private collections, a smattering of bifaces and other projectile points that have come down, that have traveled, several thousand miles from their homeland in Labrador. And I make the argument that in the case with the finds from the red paint Indian sites in Maine, um, the fact that these objects are included in mortuary deposits with red ochre suggests to me that somehow the stories, the the story about the Caribou House, or about the symbolic power of the Ramah chert, and how it's pleasing to the animal masters, uh, comes with it. It's not just the objects themselves, but the story comes with it. Um, and again, I come back to the point. I'm making it up, but it's interesting that this is the association that you find when it gets to New England. So, part two. Let's quickly go to, I want to show you what the Mature Quarry looks like, and give you some idea of the kind of landscapes that are being traversed thousands of years ago by Native American, by the ancestors of today's Native Americans in the Northeast. So you come up the coast of Labrador. You leave the Maritimes behind with their lovely, spruce forest. You leave Newfoundland behind. You come up the Labrador coast because of the Arctic current coming down from Greenland. It's a classic Arctic landscape, chock full of ice, sunk the Titanic. Um, and you leave the forest behind. You get on the north coast of Labrador, um, and it's a stunningly it's a dramatic landscape. I love this slide because I like to say that this slide, it's a Mugford Tickle, it's the Bishop's Mitre, but it shows the history of the world, so that the bottom rounded gray rock is the Labrador bedrock is 3.4, 3.2 billion years old. It's among the oldest extant rock on the planet. And then there's this slight um, inconsistency. There's a little break there, and then the reddish rock that rises above it is the Comet Formation, which is 1.8 billion. And then on top of that, there's a little dusting of Pleistocene tills 8,000 years ago. So give or take, that there's a couple of pieces missing, but the history of the planet is in these rocks. It's in this place, and that must affect the spiritual nature of things as well. Go a little further up the coast, and you get into the heart of the Torn Gap Mountains, um, and it's and they're imposing. Um, their drama and the ruggedness has always, I think, been a place of spiritual awe and significance to the native peoples that live there. Harbors are few and far between, but there's one as you go past the Ramah Bay itself, there's a nice harbor just north of there. And from there, you can access, and what we see here is a picture of the Ramah Chert Quarry. It's in this cirque. It's in the center, the right center photograph. And you can come up from the coast, come up the stream, and there's a little narrow passageway. So I think I have pictures. So coming up from the coast, you sort of ascend into this narrow valley, and you have to cross this band of iron-rich rock, which is stained blood-like, um, from exposure to the air, which I just can't help but think figures significantly in the story of this place, so that you're going to the place where you're going to get the stone that does that most sacred thing, the killing and butchering of animals and dealing with the souls of animals. And to go through that, you have to sort of go through the body of the earth itself, this living band of life in earth. And then that immediately after you climb out of that little patch, you enter into this cirque-like arrangement where you can find these veins of just extraordinarily high quality Ramah chert. And the ground is just, and for 7,000 years, people have been coming here and collecting the stone from which to fashion their tools. And the ground is littered with biface fragments, rejected blocks that were for some reason considered not worth carrying forth. And then all around the quarry site area, you find campsites where people have reduced the Ramah, um, thinning the blocks to get the biface chunks, the quarry blanks, we call them, from which to carry south, and then to shape into the final tools. If we go back now to the Labrador prehistory, following the Maritime Archaic period, there's a sequence of Indian occupations, and won't go into them now. But the immediate ancestors of the Innu, the Indian people that live in Labrador today, um, are generally thought of by anthropologists as caribou hunting specialists, people that for the most part lived in the interior of Labrador. They came out to the coast, but we won't go there. And they're closely associated with hunting caribou. And indeed, if you go to the Pequot Museum in Connecticut, the opening story they have of Paleo-Indian caribou hunting diorama is predicated on an ethnographic reconstruction of the Innu. So I tell my Innu friends that they are the intellectual bedrock of northeastern Indian identity, and they take it or leave it. But um, as far back in time as we can track the Innu ancestors, um, they their sites are exclusively composed of Ramah chert tools and debitage. And I, 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 this is strange because there's lots of good stone to make tools out of that's much closer than 400 miles further north along that arduous coastline to access the Ramah chert quarries. So I was always puzzled as an archaeologist why Innu people should be so wedded to Ramah chert, such that at campsites, you often find very good byfaces that have been disposed of by placing into a fire to and destroyed. They're shattered by heat. It's almost as if, and again, I'm making it up, but it's almost as if the tools, by association with cutting and killing animals, have become loaded with some kind of symbolic magic or symbolic attributes that needed to be dealt with. And one way of doing that was by symbolically destroying it or returning it to a spiritual abode by placing it into the fire. And archaeologists talk about projectile points as if they were people. And we have to remember that, so we find these projectile points scattered around the landscape as markers of people, where they were, how far they went, the nature of their interaction with other groups, and right up to contact with Europeans. The Ramah chert Trail is spread throughout the far northeast, centered in Labrador, but down, down as far as New England. And one of the most interesting stories about Ramah chert is its appearance, at this same time period, around 1,000 years ago, at sites in New England and further south, but most dramatically at the Goddard site in Blue Hill, Maine. And just a little shout out to the Maine Archaeological Association. Steve Cox's publication on the Goddard site is going to be published any day now. So that's something to keep your eyes on, because it's going to be a very important contribution to Northeast archaeology. But at Goddard is so amazing because you have all these objects from Northern Labrador, as well as from the Minas Basin in Nova Scotia, as well as from Western New York. And it just speaks to the interconnectedness. Anthropologists always want to put like big bold lines around cultural groups and think of them as isolated, unto themselves. But I think the stone is eloquently speaking to some aspect of this far-flung, wide-ranging interconnectedness, and what form that takes is something that we get to speculate about and think about. So one aspect of the Ramah chert story is, how does it get south? And by watercraft, overland, but scattered about in Newfoundland and in Labrador and in the Quebec North Shore and down towards New England, you find these remarkable caches of Ramah chert tools that have been ceremonially placed and then abandoned. And I think the notion of a cache might be wrong, in the sense that we think of caches as something you go back to and retrieve from. These are more akin to me to like Iron Age offerings in England, where objects were placed into ponds or lakes or marshes as a kind of a ceremonial negotiation with the gods or the spirits that be. And I wonder if that's true with these caches too. There's room for some thought here, but what's dramatic about, again, is is the numbers of them, and the amount of value. You think of these things being carried for thousands of miles and then deposited in these places, marking the landscape, as it were, and somehow speaking, to interconnectedness of the region. Um, this is one of these blades that was found in a cache from Old Saybrook, from the mouth of the Connecticut River in Old Saybrook. And it's associated with um, Pennsylvania Jasper Byfaces. And it's at this time period around, I don't know, around 1800 years ago, early woodland time period, when Pennsylvania jasper is also being found in caches, kind of throughout. So there's something going on with these stone, and this to me is just an extraordinary um, association, where you have the Ramah chert associated with Pennsylvania jasper. And it's just a quick aside here, at one of the ancestral Innu sites in Labrador, we did find two flakes, thumbnail-sized flakes of a yellow butterscotchy looking Pennsylvania jasper-like material. And whether that's evidence of some material going north, I don't know. It hasn't been properly analyzed, but it's an exciting tidbit. And finally, this is the very end, I promise. These bifaces just show up in amazing places. So, here's the Ramah chert biface. This is the southernmost one I know of. Was found in an early woodland mortuary site in the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland. And then two amazing Ramah chert bifaces that come from the Great Lakes. This one from Michigan, and another one from, I guess they're both from Michigan, that were in antiquarian collections, have been sort of ferreted out by people. And, and so I just want to close with this last sort of series of images, which just, again, tries to get back to this notion of the potential spiritual nature of stone tools, that we just want to give them a kind of a practical, functional interpretation. And yet it's kind of a story throughout Northeast and Eastern North American archaeology, that these remarkable bifaces, these stone tools, appear. Here's another cache from Labrador, not Ramah chert. But the Hopewell mounds, the mounds, the long salt mounds from the upper, from the St. Lawrence Valley, all of them, many of them, feature these extraordinarily bifaces, beautifully made, often of exotic raw materials, um, and not necessarily, and not showing much in the way of use. That they're, if there's any use where on them at all, it's on the highest flake arices that are often polished, that archaeologists have interpreted as transport wear or heirlooms, pieces that might have been handled a lot over time. And the most famous example being the obsidian blades from Wyoming that are found in the Ohio Hopewell mounds. And I tend to think of these objects, here's one made out of copper, as the paraphernalia of shamans, and shamans were the intermediaries that negotiated the landscape between the world of people, of the hunters and their families, and the spiritual world of animals and the animal masters. And they were the intermediaries that traveled, to these places, and that beseeched, the animal masters, and those spirits to relinquish their wards, to let the animals come to the people who need them. And the animal lords would see, these beautiful tools as some a white flag, as some kind of peace offering, as some kind of symbol that recognizes the nature of this boundary, um, and the power that stone tools potentially have to transport us to that landscape. I have a favorite example from California, where among the Yurok and the northern native California Hoopa peoples, they have these elaborate world renewal white antelope dance ceremonies in which these large obsidian bifaces are ferreted out from wherever they've been hidden and danced, as a symbol of connecting the generations, past and present. So, there's a lot to be said about our mundane stone tools. And even if we come back to New England and look through our collections, um, uh, I just, I can't help but think, that, blood red stones, jaspers, or this lovely biface from Vermont, with these striations, but the tip has, is where the stone veined into a red chert, can't have carried some kind of symbolic connection to the past. And so that is where I'm going to leave you, with just a notion of thinking about the stories that stone tools can tell us. And my very last slide. I'm deeply impressed with Maureen Matthews' book. I can recommend it highly, but she has a wonderful discussion in it about animism, about, in Ojibwe, in Anishinaabe language. So French, um, uh, objects can be, nouns can be feminine or masculine. Among the Anishinaabe, things can be either animate or inanimate. And Irving Hallowell, this lovely anthropologist back in the 30s, was struggled with this concept of how things could be animate, and how could stones be animate. And there's a lovely discussion of the animism of stones. And I love this little quote. It says, "Are all stones alive?" And William Barron saying, "No, but some are." And then Mr. Hallowell spends, much of the rest of his career kind of trying to figure out, what makes something animate or not. And then just remember back to my very first slide, with the haunting images of the stones, on the landscape as signifying some kind of connection to the past. And here I am with the largest boulder of Ramah chert I could find, and I'm failing in my attempt to get my colleagues to help me load it onto the boat. So it's still there in Rouse's Harbor if anyone is interested in looking further afield. So with that, I thank you very much for letting me invade your evening, and I'll be glad to entertain any questions if people had them, or or feel free to contact me at the Smithsonian if there's any other information that you might desire. So thank you once again.
Thank you. This was an amazing talk. So yes, if anyone wants to send in a question to Dr. Loring, you can send it to me in the chat function. It's either at the bottom, and some Zooms have it on the side. So we already have a few questions that have come in. One is, where can you get a sample of Ramah chert?
Sadly, I don't think you can very easily. We're all very excited that the quarry bowl, the actual quarry location, was designated a Canadian National Monument just a couple years ago. So recognition of its significance as a piece of Canadian history. So it's protected.
If only you had gotten that boulder.
Well, yeah, yeah. Well, what can I say? So it's yeah, and yeah, I'll leave it at that. It's difficult. Things can, you need to know the right people.
Yes. We have another question. Were you at all influenced in your research and everything, as you studied and everything, by Maria Gimbutas, who introduced
Maria Gimbutas. I'm gonna get in trouble here because I was married to a prominent uh, uh, archaeologist that dealt with gender matters, and 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 so I know of her work, but no, I don't think I'm I'm putting
And
my
Meg's on the line, so you better be very careful.
yeah. No. I'm putting my influences with the the families that I was fortunate to travel with and be part of in Labrador.
Well, that sort of actually goes into the next question that we have. Is there any oral histories that describe such byfaces as having ceremonial purpose or power that have been shared with you?
That's a great question, and the answer, as far as I know of, is no. And I when I give variations of this talk to my Innu colleagues, um, I'm hoping that they get interested. I mean, they're amused at it, but I think they're more amused at me and my interpretations than in the insight. It's funny to see how ideas grow on people and places, and so uh, um, I know the, the the Ramah quarries now are in land that's been traditionally owned and deeded to with land claims to the Inuit people. And the Inuit had a very different technology. They didn't use bifacially flake stone. The stone tools they made are mostly ground out of slate, and polished. So they didn't have a tradition as the earlier paleo-eskimo and Indian peoples had of shaping tools by flint knapping, so to speak. Um, that said, when I was at I was in the Quarry Bowl when Parks Canada arrived with a group of Inuit elders from George River, and I met a man I'd met previously, Tivi Utuk, who's a very respected elder who grew up in the Ramah Bay area, and he had stories um, about a woman that had been turned to stone, and I was trying to tweak him to get some details, but our language and our translators didn't fit entirely well. So that's no the, the immediate connection to that stone is not something that people have told me about.
Okay, we have another question. Someone is curious if there is evidence of Ramah going northwards or east towards Greenland, or is the trading of Ramah just a maritime archaic activity?
Well, it's all the Indian peoples in Labrador. So there's Ramachur gets traded vastly beyond its location, say from 4 to 3,000 years ago. Then again around 2,000 years ago, and then again around 1,000 years ago. So there are these pulses when the Ramachur comes south. Dorset paleo-eskimo people used a little bit of Ramah chert, and pieces of it have been found on some of the islands in Hudson Strait. A few pieces have been found in Baffin Island, but it's not a big deal. It's not traveling north. And part of the complexity of the Ramah chert story is that there is an arrowhead of Ramah chert, very similar to the ones I was showing with the little corner notches, that was found in a cemetery at a Norse farm in Greenland. So whether that was taken back as a souvenir,
I was just about to ask if
from the
Vikings
Skraelings,
took any.
but no, that's the only transmission across data
Greg,
sets
I
that I'm
expect
aware of.
you to now be looking into this. We have another question about raw mature. When it's exposed to heat, does it change color or anything?
No, heat destroys it. I know a lot of chert people talk about um, um, heat treating it, to realign the chemical structure so that it makes it easier to flint knap. But heat destroys raw mature. Raw mature is I think most of us would think of it as a kind of a quartzite. It's more glassine-like, it's more like it's a coarse grained. It's more like obsidian. It's a brittle stone. It's very nice. It doesn't have many imperfections in it, so it's very nice to work. But it's a brittle stone, and there's no, the only evidence we have of heating is when they're destroyed. We find them placed in fires and stuff, and it shatters. So that's a
Okay.
question from a flint knapper.
Yes. That one more question that we can get to is, can you expand on the presence of Ramah chert in late woodland sites such as Goddard? And do you have any thoughts on how its use distribution may differ from earlier periods such as the Moorhead phase?
It is different. It is different. In the earlier period, in the Moorhead phase, the objects, I think, are, and in the caches, and in the early woodland caches, the objects are made in Labrador. They're traded south as a finished piece. At the late woodland sites, there's not a lot of Ramah, but there's some, and there's debitage associated with the tools. So in that sense, it may be that the raw material is traded down, and people are shaping tools into local styles. But it still speaks to, so it may be at Goddard and at the late woodland, it's devoid of some of the ceremonial context I feel it carries when it's found in a mortuary context or in a cache or in a service, a special deposit. But it still must carry some story about where it came from. And when I think about shamans and the role of shamans are so believable, because they believe themselves. The expedition literature, the early accounts, everybody calls them, that thinks of them as charlatans, and they're pulling stupid tricks, and they're not fooling the priests, but they're fooling the local people. But the shamans, believed in their travels, and I think when they returned, and I suspect that, as in Australia, part of shamanistic training included isolation, maybe distant, a vision quest or something. But if you're if you're an Indian community in the Ohio Valley, and guy's been gone for a couple of years, and suddenly walks back into town, he's got a grizzly bear claw necklace around his, and he's got these black Byfaces made out of obsidian. It's convincing that you're a hunter, what the world looks like, and it's convincing that he's been to an otherworldly place. And so I wonder, when you find something, Native peoples were extraordinary, adept geologists. They found all these amazing quarry sites. They found all this good stone, and other things like copper and amber and coral and shark's teeth. They found these amazing things. So when suddenly this Ramah chert shows up in Maine 1,000 years ago at the late woodlands sites, I just can't think, but there has to have been a story attached to it. And that speaks to this interconnectedness. I keep thinking that, the Wabanaki Confederacy should be reaffirmed, and the coastal, the first thing that colonial administrators do is shut down maritime transport, so that, you go to the Pequot Museum, you see those big log canoes, you see the old pictures that John White painted of fishing in Long Island Sound. People have these big ocean going canoes. The distances, 1,000 miles or 600 miles, those seem audacious to us, but Native people were adept at traveling, and I think, that there were always adventurers. There were always people that were interested in going to a faraway place, and coming back and telling those stories. So somehow I think the Goddard site, and we'll be interested to see how Steve Cox sums it all up. I can't wait. But it's an amazing demonstration of the interconnectedness of the Northeast, at that time period.
Thank you. Two more quick questions, actually. Is there any evidence of Ramah chert material traveling south or east via glacier action?
No, that's an excellent question. The quarry site is right at the edge of the ocean, and glacial ice at that time, moving from the mountains would push any glacial erratics with Ramah in it out to sea. There's no southward movement. So you'd have to imagine that, somehow a piece of ice picked up a piece of Ramah chert, carried it out to sea, and then drifted down as an iceberg, maybe down off Newfoundland or someplace or whatever. So I don't think so. There's a Ramah chert lookalike called Mistassini quartzite from central Quebec. And much of the Ramah chert story could be tweaked just a little to be a Mistassini quartzite story as well. And Mistassini is a little more problematic because it's situated in, kind of in the heart of Quebec. And there, although I don't know of any examples, but there would be the possibility of glacial transport. But thank you for the question. But I think with Ramah, there is no glacial explanation.
Okay, the last one. Do you happen to know where the arrowhead found in the Greenland cemetery or the Icelandic cemetery is located now?
It's in Greenland. It's
Okay.
not in Iceland. That's a very
Sorry,
good
Greg, you were
question.
correct.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. My gut feeling is that it's at the Danish National Museum in Copenhagen. They've been very good about returning a lot of the Greenland collections to Greenland, so it may very well be in Nuuk. It's at one of those institutions. I think you could tweak it. I think a little diligent searching could unravel that. But my gut feeling is it's in Copenhagen.
Great. Well, thank you.
Great. No. Thank you,
amazing.
guys. Thank you for the questions too.
This was an amazing talk, and the questions, everyone, was great. Yeah, so everyone, don't forget to join us next month for our speaker, which will be Alicia Parsi from the National Park Service. If you guys signed up for the Zoom link for tonight, you will get an email for that one too, so you don't have to sign up separately for that talk too. So again, Dr. Loring, thank you so much. It's always nice to have a native Massachusetts person.
No, thank you, Lindsay.
Back and talking.
Yeah.
Everyone else, have a great night. Talk to you later.
Okay, ciao.
Okay.